The briefing photograph was taken 11 days before the operation. Shot from altitude, printed in black and white, its resolution sharp enough to count the vehicles parked along the Eastern Service Road. Kharg Island, 37 kilometers off the Iranian coast in the northern Persian Gulf. The facility everyone in the intelligence community knew existed, and nobody in the public record officially acknowledged. Not a fuel depot, not a communications relay, an underground command infrastructure built beneath the island's rock, designed to survive airstrikes, naval bombardment, and the full weight of coalition electronic warfare. The Iranians had spent 14 years constructing it. They called it something that translated loosely as the root of the oil network that funded everything else. It's the root of the command architecture that directed IRGC naval operations across the Gulf. The root of the financial routing system that moved money through the strait in ways that sanctions were never designed to reach. 41 Marines from the 15th Marine Expeditionary Unit knew none of that translation. They knew the target package. They knew the timeline. They knew that at 0340 local time on the 22nd of March, 2026, they were going in. The island sits in water, the color of old glass. At night, the gas flare from the southern terminal throws orange light across 2 kilometers of sea, bright enough to read by at close range, impossible to miss from the air. The flame has burned continuously for 31 years. It does not go out when the power fails. It does not go out during storms. Yes, the Marines coming in low over the water used it as a navigation marker without meaning to. The Ospreys held 50 feet over the surface, and the flare pulled at the edge of the cockpit glass on the port side, constant and close. Staff Sergeant Renee Castillo pressed her back against the aircraft's starboard bulkhead and watched the loadmaster's hands. The loadmaster was watching the altimeter. Nobody was talking. The noise inside the Osprey at low altitude and full speed is not the kind of noise that conversation competes with. It sits below language and above comfort. You feel it in the sternum more than you hear it with the ears. Castillo had flown this profile 9 times in rehearsal. The 10th time was the only one that mattered. The western approach to Kharg Island is 12 nautical miles of open water with no terrain to hide behind. Iranian radar on the island's northern ridge covers the approach corridor completely. The solution the planners found was not stealth, it was timing. At 0330, a coalition electronic warfare package began working the island's radar infrastructure from a distance the shore-based systems could not identify or localize. Not jamming, suppression. The difference matters. Jamming tells the operators something is wrong. Suppression makes the picture go soft in ways that look like equipment malfunction. By the time the Ospreys crossed the 12 nautical mile threshold, the radar picture on the island showed an empty sea. The Ospreys came in at 0342, 2 minutes behind the planned window. As the eastern approach road had shown vehicle movement in the final satellite pass, and the flight lead had adjusted the heading to open the angle. The adjustment cost 2 minutes and changed the landing zone from the northern plateau to a gravel shelf on the island's western face, narrower, sloped, bounded on the south by a 10-meter drop to the rock shelf below. The pilots knew the revised zone from rehearsal. Knowing it and landing on it in darkness with a 10-knot crosswind were related but distinct problems. Both aircraft made it. The first Osprey flared hard, its tilt rotors screaming through the transition, and settled onto the gravel with a force that drove the landing struts to their stops. The second came in 30 seconds later, compensating left for a gust that arrived at the worst possible moment. And touched down 6 meters from the edge, close enough that the crew chief, looking down from the open ramp, could see the drop clearly. He did not mention it. 22 Marines off the first aircraft, 19 off the second. 41 total on the gravel shelf, weapons up, moving before the rotor wash died. Castillo had the western approach. Sergeant First Class David Okonkwo had the surface installation perimeter. Captain Emilio Vargas had the underground entrance. The entrance was not marked on any commercial map. It appeared in the target package as a reinforced blast door set into the island's eastern rock face, disguised behind what looked from the air like a generator housing. The disguise was effective at altitude. At ground level, after a 2-minute sprint across the island's central ridge, it was immediately obvious for what it was. The housing was real. The generators inside it were real, but the wall behind the generators was 4 meters of poured concrete faced with steel plate, and the door in it was 3 meters wide and 2 meters tall, and had a hydraulic seal that the intelligence package estimated could withstand the pressure wave from a 500-pound bomb detonated at contact distance. Corporal James Thibodeau reached it first. His assignment was not to open it. His assignment was to set the conditions for opening it. He had the shaped charge kit in a pack on his back that he had not taken off since boarding the Osprey 4 hours ago. The kit had been designed and tested specifically for this door, based on the structural analysis in the target package. The charge would not destroy the door. It would destroy the hydraulic mechanism on the left side of the frame, which would cause the door to fail partially open, which would give the breaching team the gap they needed. He placed the charge at 0351. The detonation was controlled, directed, and precise. The left side of the door swung 8 inches inward and stopped. The hydraulic fluid that had held it sealed for 11 years leaked across the threshold in a black sheet and soaked into the rock. 8 inches was not enough. Vargas looked at the gap and looked at his team and made the calculation that commanders make when the plan meets the door. He called for the mechanical spreader. The spreader was a hydraulic tool the size of a carry-on bag that could widen a gap like this one. Slowly, noisily, with absolute certainty. It would take 4 minutes. It would announce itself to everyone inside the facility. The door opened at 0357. The corridor beyond it was lit by emergency fluorescent strips running along the ceiling at 8-foot intervals. White walls, concrete floor. The smell that came out when the door moved was industrial and cold. The specific combination of recycled air, electrical insulation, and the particular staleness of a sealed underground space that has never been connected to weather. The Marines went in with that smell hitting them and did not slow down. The first level of the facility was exactly what the target package described: a staging area, vehicle maintenance bays on the left, equipment storage on the right, a guard post at the far end, sandbagged, all with 2 Iranian Revolutionary Guard soldiers behind it who had been awake for 6 of the last 8 hours and who heard the door open and the spreader working before the Marines were 20 meters into the corridor. Both guards opened fire. The muzzle flashes in the enclosed space were blinding. The noise was absolute. Lance Corporal Yemi Adeyemi took a round through the left shoulder at the initial exchange and kept moving. He would not know until the extraction that the round had passed through cleanly, taking nothing important with it. In the moment, he registered the impact as a heavy push and categorized it and kept his rifle up. The 2 guards were suppressed and secured in 90 seconds. Neither was killed. The target package had specified that capturing personnel with system access was a priority. The guards were zip-tied and left behind the sandbag wall. The stairwell at the end of the staging corridor went down 2 levels. The intel package had estimated 3 levels total. The estimate was wrong. There were 4. The 4th level was not in the original construction assessment. It appeared in signals intelligence 6 weeks before the operation, referenced obliquely in communications traffic as the lower archive, and the planners had included it in the briefing with the caveat that its configuration and purpose were not confirmed. Marines operate on unconfirmed information constantly. The caveat did not change the objective. It changed the expectation of what the objective would look like when they reached it. The 2nd level was communications. Rack-mounted hardware along both walls of a long rectangular room. Its cable runs overhead, cooling units humming loud enough to be felt in the floor. 3 technicians were inside when the Marines entered. All 3 were unarmed. All 3 were in the process of following a destruction protocol that involved physically pulling storage modules from their racks and dropping them into a chemical bath mounted in a floor unit at the room's far end. The bath used a compound that the intelligence community had cataloged from other facilities. It destroyed the magnetic coating on drives in approximately 40 seconds. The Marines reached the room before the technicians reached the bath. 2 modules made it into the chemical solution. 11 did not. Sergeant Priya Nair secured the communications room while the assault element pushed down the stairwell to the 3rd level. The 3rd level was the operations floor. It is larger than the rooms above. The ceiling was 3 meters instead of 2, and the space had the organized chaos of a room that had been in active use 10 minutes ago and had been abandoned in controlled sequence. Map boards along the northern wall showed the gulf in detail, overlaid with position markers that were color-coded in a system the Marines could read the shape of without reading the language. Workstations, radio sets, a whiteboard with handwriting across its full surface, photographed before anyone touched it. A paper shredder still running when the Marines entered, chewing through documents in a mechanical rhythm that continued until someone pulled its power cable from the wall. Vargas spent 4 minutes on the operations floor. His team photographed everything that could not be carried. They carried what could be carried. Yet they moved 2 senior officers who had been in the room and had not evacuated with the rest of the personnel. Both men were cooperative in the specific way that people are cooperative when they understand that resistance has no remaining upside. They were searched, restrained, and moved ahead of the team toward the extraction corridor. The stairwell continued below the operations floor. It was narrower here, the walls closer, the ceiling lower. The fluorescent strips spaced farther apart, so that the sections between them were genuinely dark. The Marines moved through it with their weapon lights cutting forward and the sounds of the facility around them changing, becoming more mechanical, more enclosed, the sense of pressure that comes from being deep inside rock with no easy way up. The 4th level was behind a second blast door. Yet this one was smaller than the entrance door above, and it was open. The hydraulic mechanism was still engaged, the door held in its open position by the active system, which told the Marines that power to this level was still live, and that whoever had been here last had left in enough of a hurry to not seal the room behind them. The lower archive was the size of a large conference room. Along the left wall, server infrastructure on raised flooring, the kind of installation that represents a serious capital investment and a serious operational priority. Along the right wall, physical document storage, steel shelving units with binders and cases organized by a system the Marines could not read but could photograph. At the back of the room, a communications terminal with an active connection, its screen cycling through a status display in Farsi, its transmission light blinking at steady intervals. The terminal was transmitting. Someone on the other end was receiving. Corporal Thibodeau disconnected the transmission hardware at the physical layer, pulling the cable at the back of the unit, and then pulling the power. The screen went dark. Whether the disconnection had been noticed, whether it had triggered a protocol at the receiving end, whether that protocol meant anything for the extraction timeline, none of that was answerable in the moment. The uncertainty was added to the list of things that would be resolved later. The Marines worked the lower archive for 11 minutes. It was not enough time to take everything. It was the time they had. The server infrastructure was assessed and photographed, and the drives that could be removed without specialized tools were removed. The document shelving was photographed in sections, and the materials that appeared to be most recent, based on handling and positioning, were packed. The communications terminal was secured as a complete unit, cables cut flush and packed with the hardware. At 0434, Vargas called the extraction. The route back was the same corridor they had come in. The difference was what they were carrying and who was moving with them. 2 prisoners, 11 storage modules, 1 communications terminal, server drives, a document case. The wounded, Adeyemi still on his own feet, moving steadily, his left arm held close against his body. The total weight slowed the column by 30% against the movement times from rehearsal. On the 3rd level showed them what the delay cost. The Iranian response element had reached the operations floor from an access point the target package had not identified, a maintenance corridor that came in from the island's northern service infrastructure and connected to the facility at a junction point between the communications room and the operations floor. 12 soldiers. They were not expecting the Marines to be withdrawing upward. They had positioned to cut the facility off from below. The contact happened at the operations floor stairwell junction. Confined space. No warning. Both sides in the same corridor with 3 meters between them. The exchange lasted 40 seconds and left 4 Iranian soldiers wounded and the corridor held by Marines. It also left Sergeant First Class Okonkwo with a fragment wound across his right forearm from a ricochet that had traveled the wrong way off a concrete wall. He kept his weapon up and kept moving. The stairwell from the 3rd level to the 2nd was clear. The 2nd level to the 1st was clear. The staging corridor was clear. The 2 guards behind the sandbag wall were exactly where the Marines had left them. The blast door at the entrance opened more easily from inside. It had been designed that way. The hydraulic mechanism that controlled the interior release was intact, and Thibodeau used it. And the door swung out into the generator housing with the sound of damaged metal moving on damaged rails. The gap was wider now, wide enough to walk through without turning sideways. Yet the night air came in cold and smelled of salt and the gas flare's combustion products. And every Marine who passed through that threshold registered the change the way people register air after a long time without it. The gravel shelf was 90 seconds away at the pace they were moving. The Ospreys were not on the shelf. They were holding 3 kilometers west over open water, circling at 200 feet. The decision to hold rather than land and wait had been made by the flight lead based on the vehicle activity the final satellite pass had shown on the Eastern Service Road. A ground asset holding on an open shelf with rotor wash announcing its position to every observer on the island for the duration of the operation was a different risk calculation than a circling aircraft that was difficult to acquire visually at night. Yet the flight lead had made the call. It was the right call. The Marines on the shelf radioed their position and the Ospreys began their inbound run. The 4 minutes between the radio call and the aircraft arrival were the 4 minutes in which the Eastern Surface Security Element reached the island's central ridge and identified the Marines on the shelf. The Eastern Element was 8 soldiers. They came over the ridge at 0441 and saw the shelf below them and the Marines on it and opened fire from the high ground. The position was tactically correct, firing down from elevation onto a confined space with limited cover. The Marines on the shelf had 3 options. Return fire uphill against a position that had the angle, disperse off the shelf into terrain that offered no improvement, hold and collapse the perimeter. Emma Castillo made the decision without convening it. She put her team on the northern face of the shelf, where the rock rose 2 meters and gave partial defilade from the ridge fire, and she anchored the southern end with the saw gunner, and she held the shelf. The fire from the ridge was sustained and close. 2 Marines took rounds in the body armor without penetration. One took a graze across the left thigh that bled seriously and required a pressure bandage applied in 30 seconds by the corpsman who had already moved to him. The Ospreys arrived at 0445. The first aircraft came in from the west with its nose gun working the ridge in a 2-second burst that was enough to suppress without enough visibility to be precise. The Marines on the shelf heard the change in the incoming fire. Because of the reduction in volume and the shift in rhythm that happens when people who are shooting are now also taking fire, and they loaded in sequence. Prisoners first, wounded, intel bags, remaining personnel. The second Osprey took the last 8 Marines, including Castillo, at 0447. The aircraft turned west over open water. Below them, Kharg Island held its position in the dark Gulf, the gas flare still burning orange at the southern terminal, unchanged, indifferent, marking the same coordinates it had marked for 31 years. The facility beneath the eastern rock face was dark. Its transmission terminal was in a bag on the aircraft floor. Its drives were in sealed cases. Its officers were restrained in the forward cargo section. At 0530 local time, CENTCOM released a single sentence through official channels. Only elements of the 15th Marine Expeditionary Unit had conducted operations in the northern Persian Gulf. An assessment was ongoing. The sentence did not mention Kharg Island. It did not mention the underground facility. It did not mention what had been found on the 4th level or what the communications terminal had been transmitting at the moment of disconnection or who had been receiving. These were details that would move through different channels at different speeds toward different audiences. What moved through the public channels first was the Iranian response. State television broadcast a statement at 700 describing an act of aggression against sovereign Iranian infrastructure. The broadcast showed no footage of the facility. It showed no footage of the island. It described casualties in terms that did not match what the Marines knew of the exchange. It used the word unprovoked 4 times in 3 minutes and did not explain what the facility beneath the eastern rock face had been used for, or why it had been constructed with 4 levels instead of 3. Behind the public statement, something different was moving through the IRGC command structure. 11 storage modules from the communications room were in American hands. The document case from the lower archive was in American hands. The communications terminal and its connection logs were in American hands. Every officer in the command network that had been routed through the lower archive server infrastructure was now operating with the knowledge that the Americans had what they had. Yet the behavioral response to that knowledge was immediate and visible. Communication protocols across the Gulf operational network were suspended within hours of the operation. Not modified, suspended. New ones would have to be built from scratch, using personnel and resources that had previously been allocated to operational activity. Safe houses linked to the network's financial routing infrastructure were vacated before noon. Their occupants did not go to new locations within the existing network. They went dark. 3 senior officers whose names appeared in the document case were removed from their posts before the evening briefing. Their replacements were announced in language that was directed inward as much as outward. The failure had produced consequences. And the consequences were visible to everyone in the organization who needed to see them. The gas flare above the southern terminal of Kharg Island burned through the night and into the next morning. It had been burning when the facility was constructed, and it burned after the facility was emptied. The flame did not mark what had been there. It marked only what it had always marked, which was the raw material that everything else was built on, rising and burning and going nowhere. Aboard the ship where the extracted intelligence was being processed, a signals analyst sat in a windowless compartment at 1100 local time and looked at the connection log from the communications terminal. The log showed transmission activity going back 14 months. It showed the receiving endpoints, encrypted but logged. It showed the timing patterns and the duration and the volume of data transferred in each session. Some of the endpoints resolved to locations the analyst already had files on. Some of them resolved to locations that were not in any existing file. The analyst opened a new document and began building the file. The operation had taken 67 minutes from the first Marine stepping off the Osprey to the last Marine stepping back on. In those 67 minutes, a facility that had taken 14 years to build had been entered, documented, partially stripped, and left with its fourth level open and its transmission network severed. What happened to the fourth level afterward was not immediately known. Iranian engineering teams would have reached it within hours of the Marines' departure. What they found there is what remained after the extraction, what they decided to do with what remained. Those were questions that moved into the category of things known only by the satellite imagery that would arrive with the next morning's pass and the signals intercepts that would accumulate across the following week. And the assessment that would eventually be written in a building in Virginia, where the people writing it had access to the connection log that the analyst was still building at 1100 local time, working carefully and without rushing, because the log was long and the locations it described were numerous, and some of them were in places where the existence of the connection itself was the most important piece of information that had come out of the facility at all. The Marines who had gone in and come out were on a ship in the Gulf, cleaning weapons and eating and sleeping in the specific compressed way that people sleep when they have been awake for 20 hours and know they may be awake again in 4. Adeyemi's shoulder had been assessed and dressed and assessed again and was going to be fine. Okonkwo's forearm had been closed and wrapped and was going to be fine. The Marine with the thigh graze had been treated and was already arguing about whether the graze qualified as a wound or an inconvenience. And the argument was the kind that happens when the adrenaline has left the body, and what remains is the slightly manic clarity of people who went somewhere difficult and came back. The gas flare burned at the southern terminal of Kharg Island. The fourth level of the facility sat open in the dark beneath the eastern rock face. As the connection log grew longer in the windowless compartment, and in the command network that had once routed through the lower archive, officers who had spent 14 years building something beneath a rock in the Persian Gulf were making different decisions about what they could use, and what they could trust, and where they could operate. And those decisions would take time to make and time to implement. And in that time, the network would be something less than what it had been the day before the Ospreys crossed the 12 nautical mile threshold over dark water, with the gas flare pulling at the edge of the cockpit glass. The briefing photograph from 11 days before the operation had shown the facility's entrance disguised as a generator housing. Yet the photograph taken by satellite on the morning after the operation showed the same generator housing, unchanged in shape, with the blast door partially visible behind it at an angle that suggested the door had not been resealed. A notation in the margin of the satellite assessment, written in the compact handwriting of an analyst who had been looking at overhead imagery of Kharg Island for 3 years, said only, "Door status, open." It was the most accurate thing written about the operation that morning. The intelligence exploitation began the same night. The 11 storage modules from the communications room went to a technical team that had been waiting on the ship since the Ospreys crossed back over the horizon. The team worked in a space that had been configured specifically for this kind of material, and isolated from the ship's primary network, temperature controlled, with the kind of quiet that comes from soundproofing, installed over steel bulkheads. They worked in shifts of 4 hours each, because the concentration required to do what they were doing correctly was the kind that degrades past that threshold and produces errors that matter. The first modules were readable without decryption. Their encryption had been suspended during the destruction protocol the technicians were running when the Marines entered the communications room. The suspension was a procedural step that had to happen before the chemical bath could verify what it was destroying. The Marines had interrupted the protocol before the verification completed, which meant the encryption suspension was still active on the drives that had not made it into the bath. All the technical team noted this in their initial assessment and noted it again in the formal report, and understood that what they had was the kind of access that comes once and needs to be used correctly because there will be no second chance of this particular kind. The modules held 14 months of routing logs, communication records, and what appeared to be financial transaction data, structured in a format that required a specialist to interpret and that the technical team's financial analyst began working on at 0200, while the signals team worked the communication records in parallel. The financial data was organized by account reference rather than by institution or jurisdiction. The reference system was internal, specific to this network, and had been designed to be opaque to anyone without the key. Yes, the key was in the document case from the lower archive. Not obviously, not labeled, but it was there, in a set of tables that looked like maintenance schedules until the financial analyst looked at the numerical sequences and recognized the pattern. The recognition took 4 hours and 1 cup of coffee, and the specific sensation of something clicking into place that analysts describe differently, but that all of them know when it happens. By 0600, the technical team had a partial map of the financial routing infrastructure that the lower archive had been managing. Partial because 14 months of records needed more than 4 hours to process. Partial because some of the reference codes in the document case tables did not appear in the modules, and suggesting additional records that had either been in the drives that made it into the chemical bath or were stored at a location that the operation had not reached. Partial because the endpoint resolution on some of the financial routes led to jurisdictions where the tracing would require coordination with foreign partners and time, and the kind of patient work that does not happen on a ship in the Persian Gulf. But partial was not nothing. Partial was a map with sections filled in and sections blank, and a map with sections filled in tells you something about the sections that are blank, tells you where to look next, tells you what the architecture of the unknown portion is likely to resemble, based on what the known portion shows you. Yet the analyst who had built the connection log from the communications terminal added pages to it as the financial analyst's work intersected with the signals records, and by the time the morning watch changed, the log had become something that would take weeks to fully analyze, and that would not stop being useful when the analysis was done.